Good morning. Welcome to Trinity Episcopal Parish's book study over the Mosaic of Christian Belief by Roger Olsen. In this book, we are discussing various Christian theology and different approaches within the Christian tradition to that theology. This is involving an examination of a lot of the basics of Christian tradition, biblical studies, theology, history, things like that. Please do catch up with some of the discussions we've had so far, as many of those things are really important to the way we discuss how we understand God in the Christian tradition. Today is going to be perhaps one of the most contemporarily important questions as it comes to contemporary approaches to theology. And today we are talking about God's providence. In a wide brushstroke describing God's providence, what this refers to, and of course we have right in the word providence, we have God's involvement in creation, specifically God's will being worked in what happens in the world. And so the area of discussion this morning is, the reason why this is so important is because this involves a couple of questions that we do not really have a good grasp on as it comes to the past 2,000 years, or even longer than that. Because it asks fundamental questions about a couple of things that, in all honesty, we haven't really sussed out one perfect answer to, whether that be in theology or philosophy. And that question is two particular ones. The big one is the problem of evil. And this very simply states, if God exists, why is there evil? If God exists, why is there evil? This is a huge question for theists. Because what this gets at is, if God is providential, if God is God, and nothing within the pervading world happens without God's will, does God will evil? Now you can see how this is a big, big question, a really, really important question for us as Christians. Because if God wills evil, can we say that God is good? If we say that God allows evil, what kind of God do we serve? You see how this is a very, very important question. And so, the problem of evil is in the background of this, but also another one, another really important one, which is human freedom. And the question behind human freedom how free are we? How free are we in our freedom? Another way to put this is, are we free at all? And these two questions are the huge questions behind how we get at God's providence. Both of these questions will fundamentally influence the way that we discuss these things. So I want to point these two out before we get started, because when we get into the discussion, you will come across the theologies that we talk about, and you will have an emotive reaction to some of them, because both of these will, in fact, sometimes be violated, at least in your mind. At the surface of the theologies around God's providence, you may encounter something that seems like it violates these two things. But again, this is why it is so important to have these discussions over theology. Because in the theological spectrum in Christianity, the providence of God attempts to answer both of these in a satisfactory way. That is both biblically cognizant, theologically holds together, and describes what we see in the world. But these two questions are the ones that are going to come up again and again. So remember, the problem of evil and human freedom. And think very closely about the role of these things as we discuss God's providence. You will be in good company, because many, many, many hundreds of theologians in the Christian tradition have wrestled with these questions. But, of course, what we always start with is, where is the consensus within the Christian tradition? The consensus of the Christian tradition lies in several points that are largely agreed upon, but have massive amounts of wiggle room in them. Which is why, when it comes to God's providence, there are actually denominations of Christianity that have formed in and of themselves in complete, in almost a complete reaction to theologies of God's providence. There are denominations that form themselves around certain views of God's providence. And so when we start talking about these, please recognize that I am being descriptive in the way that I describe these things, and I'm not telling you what to think. Because these are incredibly intense arguments that we can get into. But the general consensus is, maybe in an unsatisfactory manner, nothing happens that God does not at least permit. Nothing in the world happens without God's involvement in some way, shape, or form. Now, what does that mean? That's where we get into the diversity of belief. But here are the general things that Christians have agreed on. Number one, God is sovereign over nature and history. One way that we can kind of talk about this is God is governor. God governs nature and history. Basically what this means is that anything that occurs within nature and history, God is sovereign over it. God is governor over it. In other words, there is not something that happens that God does not at least permit. And so, when we get to God is sovereign, what that means is a very basic Christian stance. All the way back to Genesis, all the way through the Bible, God is sovereign over all, over everything that happens. And because God is sovereign, this also connects really closely with our discussion of God's involvement with creation that we had last week. God's not just sovereign over all, God is involved in nature and history. Hence why governor might be a good word for this. God is involved in nature and history. God's not removed from it. God is sovereign, his transcendence, but God is also involved in the creation. Number two. Now, I've said this a couple times already, but this is a really important one. Nothing happens that God does not at least permit. That one is the one that gets the most debate. This one is the one in which is going to be where the rubber hits the road, so to speak. Because this one deals directly with the problem of evil. Nothing happens that God does not at least permit. Even in the language we use here, nothing happens that God does not at least permit. Notice that it doesn't say nothing happens that nothing happens outside of God's own will. Because guess what? That is a theological stance on this. But nothing happens that God does not at least permit also tries to hold in tension God's sovereign involvement and providence over what happens in nature and history. God is both not swinging all the way to one side, nor swinging to the other. Again, this is Olsen's view in the both-and theology rather than an either-or theology. This one's one that we'll discuss here in just a minute, so hold your thoughts. But number 3, God's sovereignty or governance is both general and special. General in the way that God generally is sovereign over natural laws, and special in that God is sovereign over personal interactions and personal dealings. In other words, our lives. Let's take a biblical approach to this real quick. God is sovereign over nature and history. You see this concept all throughout the Bible. You can look at the book of Romans, in chapters 1 and 2, to talk about God's sovereignty as it comes to human sin. But more generally, you can look to the prophets in the Old Testament to talk about God's absolute sovereignty over everything. In fact, even in our readings in morning prayer in the book of Exodus, in the liberation of the people of Israel from Egypt, God exercises his sovereignty over nature and history explicitly in what he does there. And this is where we get into general and special. God is sovereign over general things like natural laws. Hence, when we talk about the plague sent on Egypt or the miracles performed by Jesus, God has sovereignty over nature's laws as well. Whereas nature would say that water cannot be turned into wine, God has sovereignty and freedom within the natural law. We say that because Jesus is God, that God's will for what happens enacts itself in what we would call a special dispensation from what God has set up in natural laws. That God can do what God wants within the confines of creation because God has made it. Again, back to the chapter on creation last week. But he's sovereign because his will is enacted through the way that nature occurs. So, whereas last week we were describing God's relationship with nature as it comes to a descriptor, now we're talking about God's will in providence. God's will is worked out generally in natural law and specifically in our lives. Hence, it can be both an acting of God's will in nature itself and especially in our lives by Jesus and the Holy Spirit's actual indwelling within us. That God's action, God's will is perfectly worked out in these ways. And God's will ultimately will be worked out in the end. This is the consensus that you'll find throughout the Christian tradition. But now let's take a historical approach to these things. Historically, in the early church, leading all the way up to the 5th century, you have two things held in tension. So remember these three things right here. Because now we're going to shift to talking about how we get to such diversity within the Christian tradition as it comes to these things. I'm not going to describe the diverse positions yet. What I'd like for everybody to know is just descriptively how these questions have been dealt with historically. So remember those consensus points, especially number 2, because now we're going to talk about a little bit of history. Again, this is a very important chapter. Through the first and 5th centuries, you have 2 things that are generally held in tension, that are not necessarily exhaustively explained until we get later. And these 2 things are God's will is perfectly enacted without God causing evil. Okay. Number 1, God's will is perfectly enacted without God causing evil. This is something that you will find in Irenaeus. This is something that you'll find in Tertullian. These are things that you'll find throughout the 1st and 5th century. God's will is perfectly enacted without God being the cause of evil. Because God is perfectly good. We do not say, as I said last week, we do not say that God causes evil. God is not the cause nor the source of evil. This is something that undeniably is the consensus in early Christianity. But you'll also find, number 2, that humanity actually does have an amount of free will. Humanity is in some way imbued with an ability to make choices. We have a freedom to will that which we will. A way to describe this is that in philosophy, the question of free will often involves, do we have the ability to choose otherwise? If we do not have the ability to choose otherwise, then we have no free will. That's generally the way that philosophers will take this. Do we have the ability to choose otherwise? If we do, how do we do it? If we don't, why not? But within the early church, because of the interaction with God with humanity, in which there is a dynamic relationship with God and humanity that doesn't change God's essential godness, but nonetheless, there is interactions with humanity that also seem to affect the way that God's will works. For example, when the people of Israel create the golden calf at Mount Horeb in Exodus, after God gave them the law, God, who's talking with Moses, wishes to push Moses aside and say, let me alone, let me consume this people before me who are evil, who have done these evil things. Moses intercedes for the people of Israel on their behalf, and it actually, very literally, in the language, says that God changes his mind about the disaster he was going to bring on the people. So the question is, of course, enacted without God causing evil, and that humanity does have an amount of free will, hence the free will to choose the evil in this case. How do we say that God's will is perfectly enacted if it seems like God has a dynamic relationship with Moses? God changes his mind about what he's going to do. How does that interact with how God's perfect will is enacted? That's a big question right there. But biblically, you have instances where these things kind of happen. And if you think about it, this is kind of the basis of why prayer is very interesting. Your particular understanding of God's providence directly affects your prayer life. Because depending on what you view of God's providence, may affect whether you think that your prayers are effective. This is kind of a practical outcropping of a type of providence that we'll talk about later in just a little bit. But it really does, praxeologically, it practically affects the way that we actually function within the Christian tradition, depending on what your idea of God's providence is. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven comes to mind when we think about this. But again, we have to ask Jesus kind of directly, what do we mean by God's will be done, if that makes sense. But the 1st and 5th century, we held these two in tension. However, the big name that you need to know as it comes to this question that has for time immemorial affected the way that the West thinks about this, the one name you need to remember that has profoundly affected this conversation is Augustine of Hippo. John Calvin loved Augustine. Martin Luther was an Augustinian monk. So when you think about Reformation theology as it comes to God's providence, they don't come up with this stuff off the fly. This dude right here is the one where they look to. Augustine of Hippo lives at a time when the Roman Empire, the physical Roman Empire, is crumbling around him. He is writing, and it's interesting that the most influential Western theologian writes at a time of incredible upheaval, where his actual nation of Rome is crumbling. Augustine writes in a very particular context. In fact, the Two Cities, which is one of his great works, is an answer to some people who said, well, I thought that Rome was the city of God. I thought Rome was the physical city that God had described. And Augustine writes the Two Cities to rebuff this and say, no city on earth is the city of God. The city of God is the heavenly city. But in those works, Augustine profoundly changes the conversation on this because he tries to synthesize those two views. What Augustine tries to do is synthesize God's perfect will being done without causing evil and human free will. Augustine is arguably the father of what we call meticulous providence, which we will discuss here in just a minute as one of the diverse opinions within Christian tradition. Augustine talks about meticulous providence in that absolutely nothing is done outside of God's will, and that although we perceive certain things as being evil, God ultimately actively wills for everything that happens within the world to happen exactly the way it happens. The reason why Augustine writes this with certain levels of convincing or not being convincing is that when Rome crumbles, Augustine writes to his people and writes this because even in the midst of what seems to be the destruction of something that was good, an actual city of people, an actual empire that houses people within it, even though we perceive this as being a cruel evil, Augustine wants to point us and say, even through all of this, God's will is perfectly enacted because of God's meticulous providence. That God controls literally everything that happens in the world. God does not cause evil, but God does not cause evil, but God controls the ultimate end of evil. In fact, he even says quite famously that humans, in our free will, are where evil arises from in our sin. And this is, of course, his idea of original sin, that we are originally bent from the womb. That although we are sinful from birth and we cause sin in all various kinds of ways, God controls sin so that his ultimate will is still accomplished. And so God does not cause evil, but God controls evil and uses it towards the ends that God's will ultimately points to. Meticulous providence is probably something that many of us associate with John Calvin. But John Calvin gets this from Augustine. And the thing is that when we think about meticulous providence, we have to think about Augustine. Because the reason why Augustine writes these things is for a very contextual reason. Because if you think about the Reformation, what else was happening in the Reformation? The church, which was in the Western tradition, the Holy Roman Catholic Church, was splintering to pieces in the wake of Protestantism. There was massive political and theological upheaval happening at this time. Calvin has to answer the question, why did God allow it? Likewise, Augustine, in the crumbling of the Roman Empire, has to answer the question, why does God allow this to happen? In other words, the problem of evil. If God is God, why is there evil? That's the question we're trying to get at. And when Augustine formulates meticulous providence, God's ultimate providence over absolutely everything that happens in the world, he's trying to synthesize human free will with God's ultimate will being enacted. And in the way that he works that out is meticulous providence. So, that is the historical development of some of these questions. We need to now talk about the alternatives. The alternatives to God's providence. These are the things that are largely on the edge or outside of general Christian tradition. And you'll find these in various shapes and forms, but they all have to do with whether God's will is enacted or how God has will. The first one is fatalism. Fatalism will say that, and the word fate is within there. What fatalism says is that we are ultimately at the whims of the random fates of the world. And what this basically says is that God has no will, and the only thing that exists is randomness. Or randomness can also be termed chaos. So fatalism looks at evil in the world, or looks at the changes and chances of the world, human freedom within the world, and fatalism basically says that God has no will, and only chaos exists. And in fact, fatalism will sometimes go so far as to say humans have no will either. So humans have no will. I should say free will. In other words, everything is up to the changes and chances of the world. The thing about fatalism, though, is that it even says, insofar as it comes to the natural order, that even the natural order is subject to randomness. That within the world is enacted a kind of unguided naturalism, if that makes sense. There's nothing that guides anything, not even natural law. This is why this is not the same thing as naturalism. Naturalism has a very high view of natural mechanism. Fatalism has no regard for natural mechanism. Fatalism basically says things that happen because they're going to happen. There's no purpose, there's no will, there's no reason behind these things. Only randomness exists. This is a fairly obvious. This is fairly obvious with, that it's outside of Christianity because, of course, we say that God is intimately involved in all of these things. That God has no free will in order to enact these things. Humans have no free will either. Now, again, both of these points are something that can be strongly argued against within the Christian tradition itself. Hence, how do we choose to follow Jesus or not if we have no free will? The main thing about this one, though, to remember is that fatalism does not believe that the natural order of the universe actually has an order to it. It believes that everything is disordered. Everything has no order. So that's just something to remember. Fatalism, fairly obvious. It removes all agency from God and from humanity. There's no agency whatsoever. It only says that what happens, happens. That is a fairly easy thing to point to philosophically and theologically as to why there are problems with this. If everything is only randomness, why is there order in the way that we recognize natural order? Why is there order in the way that we as humans order our lives? There are ways that we actually ritually enact order within our lives, whether that be through church service or even the way that we get up in the morning, that seems to resist randomness. From both a psychological perspective and from a natural perspective. And so even naturalists are going to have a problem with fatalism. Because fatalism is a metaphysical position. It's not something that is a scientific position. It is an interpretation of what we see and how we understand God acting or not acting within it. So fatalism is number one. Number two, our old friend, deism. Now, deism has come up a couple of times in the past several chapters because deism not only has a certain view of God's ontology, what God is, deism has a certain view as to how God works as well. By virtue of how we understand who God is, it also will, by necessity, affect the way that we understand God's providence working. Deism is similar to fatalism, but not the same. What deism will say is that, again, God has no will. Generally, deism will also say that God has no way of enacting his will. God enacts. Sorry, let me adjust this a little bit. It's not that God doesn't have any free will. God enacts his will in a certain way. God enacts his will through natural law, and not through intervention. What this basically means, and the reason why I wanted to adjust what I said there, it's not that God doesn't have any free will. It's that the way that God enacts his will is through natural laws, and not through special intervention. Natural laws for deism is the same thing as what deism says about God himself. Deism relies on God's ultimate transcendence and doesn't believe that God is immanently involved in the creation at all. God is the God who's up here, who creates the universe in the natural law and sets the initial parameters and lets it go, and is utterly uninvolved interpersonally, unless it has to do with natural law. So God creates the law of gravity, God creates the laws of thermodynamics, God creates all of these various things, lets them work themselves out through the way that they naturally occur, and not through intervention in creation, not through God coming down and messing with creation. Deism, while it might explain the way that natural law happens, and the way that deism kind of removes God's culpability for evil, because God doesn't enact anything except through natural law. So basically, God does not have any agency over the way that the creation does these things. God's just letting it do what it wants. But it doesn't account to the central revelation of God in Jesus Christ. We as Christians, of course, take our name Christians from Jesus Christ, whom Christians believe is really God, really made human. And if that's not an intervention, I don't know what it is. A divine intervention, so to speak. And so deism tries to answer the question of human free will and the problem of evil by removing God from the equation as it comes to creation. God nonetheless creates, but God is not intimately involved in creation. If there is a God, that God is removed from the universe in such a way that has no interaction. The way that God's will is enacted is through how he sets up the initial parameters of his nature. Whether that actually is will or not is a subject of debate, but that's the way that deists will point. And again, the not through intervention removes God's culpability for evil. However, it also removes God from being within Christian tradition as well. Throughout Christian tradition, the Old Testament and New Testament, God is intimately involved in the creation. And therefore God's will is being enacted in a personal intervening level, such as the giving of the law to Moses on Mount Sinai, such as the giving of the New Testament in Jesus Christ our Lord, etc., etc. So that's what deism will say. There's a third one. The third alternative is sometimes referred to as process panentheism. I want to be real careful with this one, because this one's a live wire. Process panentheism, sometimes called process theology, every theology that is done within the Christian tradition and within philosophy in general is trying to answer a really important question. Process theology, process panentheism, really tries hard to answer why God is not culpable for evil. So it tries to answer the problem of evil. And depending on who you are, it answers it very well. And this is why. Process panentheism basically says that God cannot change and act or enact his will other than convincing and leading human will. Now, let's break this down. God cannot change or enact his will other than convincing and leading human will. When we get to ultimate questions of evil, why did God allow the Holocaust to occur? If God could have prevented Hitler, why did God not do so? If God could prevent my child from suffering the way that they did or do, why does God not do it? Process theology answers this question in a very specific way. That actually what process theology says is that God convinces and leads, God cajoles in some way, shape, or form us into the way that we should go, but that God cannot change or enact his will other than that convincing and leading. What that does is it removes God's culpability from causing evil. If God cannot change or enact his will other than through humanity's will, what that does is that removes God's culpability for evil. In other words, the Holocaust happened because God could not prevent it. The suffering of this child is happening because God could not prevent it. God does not will those things. God does not want the Holocaust to happen, nor should he ever. God does not want this child to suffer, nor should he ever. But God cannot change that. The only way that God can enact that will is through convincing it and leading human will. In other words, God's testimony to humanity is something that should have been, in a perfect world, would have been something that we would have actually resisted the Holocaust and Hitler. That's something that God would have led us away from in this particular purview. However, in answering the question of evil, what process theology does is it removes God's ability to affect things. God cannot change or enact his will, which, while answering a good question, causes incredible problems with ultimate questions such as what happens after I die. It removes God's ability to change, and it answers the problem of evil, but this removes God's ultimate will. What do I mean by that? It removes God's ultimate will because God actually cannot bring about the kingdom of God. God actually cannot enact the kingdom of God without the leading of human will. In fact, Olsen points out God points out, Olsen points out an interesting little thing about God that's sometimes said about God, about humans ask God, God executes. This actually flips that order, where God convinces humanity and humanity executes. It removes God's ultimate will. And it removes God's ultimate will, because that word ultimate right here means the ultimate end of things. It removes the ability for God to actually usher in his kingdom. Rather, the kingdom of God is something that is said to be continuously occurring through the work of humanity. There's, of course, nuance in this, but the big problem that process theology creates in God's providence is that in answering the problem of evil, it removes God's ability to actually enact the kingdom, which is something that we hold very strongly in the Gospels in the New Testament. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven, is not just a pipe dream. It's an affectation of reality. And so what happens is that in focusing on God's eminence and in God's ultimately with creation, of course, panentheism will say that creation affects God. Again, this is an ontological thing. Does God change or not? Process panentheism would say God does change, and so God, by virtue of being changeable by humanity, ultimately also has ultimate will removed from God. It's just a necessary thing that happens in that view. But in the traditional view of God, God is ultimately enacting God's will, whether we will it or not. But again, this is trying to answer the problem of evil, right? The diversity of opinion within Christian tradition is going to fall along the lines of whether you like Augustine or not. For many of us, that might be a no. For many of us, that might be a yes. But our diversity within the Christian tradition is an incredible diversity, and it all falls along whether you like meticulous providence or not. That might be a little too much of a blanket statement, but largely this is true. Our diversity relies in three places. The one we talked about earlier, meticulous providence, something called self-limiting providence, and a relatively new one that's called open theism. Meticulous providence we've talked about already. Meticulous providence basically says that everything is meticulously controlled by God. You can find really good logical evidence for this within Scripture and in traditional Christian theology. If God is God, how can we say that God does not ultimately enact what God wants? God being God, but even in an intuitive sense, means that God has a control wider than our own control. Even in the most simple ways, God's providence at least lies over the top of something. And so, in God's ultimate providence, in meticulous providence, from Augustine and Calvin and Huldrych Zwingli, and a lot of our theologians since then, meticulous providence is actually an answer to the problem of evil. Because everything is meticulously controlled by God, again, in the Augustinian sense, and what it will add is that while God does not cause evil, God controls it. For example, in a meticulous providence, when we have, let's say, a tragedy befall someone, in God's meticulous providence, we, in some ways, need to be able to say, using this particular thing, again, you might not like this, but this is what meticulous providence will say, that this has happened per God's will, but that God does not will evil. God controls it. This is where the everything happens for a reason comes in. For some of you, that has caused intense amounts of pain when someone says that to you. It's definitely not a pastoral response. Everything happens for a reason in the face of tragedy is probably one of the worst things you can say, pastorally. But logically, everything is meticulously controlled by God is an outgrowth of that view. In other words, another way to look at this is actually in a very healthy way. That God did not randomly allow the universe to cause this to happen. That there is an ultimate reason behind this. It provides a teleology, a goal-orientedness. This happened so that something else can happen, that good comes out of it. God does not cause the evil. God, we would say, does not cause a tragedy to happen, but God controls the tragedy. Again, this may or may not be something that you really like, but meticulous providence would have this view of the world. This is where people have this view from. This is where good Christians have that view in meticulous providence. That's the broad brushstroke meticulous providence. There are all kinds of nuances that you can throw in there. But one nuance that meticulous providence had, and it branched off into a new one, is the one that we'd say is self-limiting. The self-limiting providence. Whereas meticulous providence says that God's will is enacted broad blanket in everything, what self-limiting providence wants to do is create a distinction between God's perfect will versus God's permissive will. So, in self-limiting providence, what theologians along these lines would say is that there is a distinction between what God's perfect will for the universe is and what God's permissive will for the universe is. What this attempts to answer is is a problem that meticulous providence has, because meticulous providence, in a lot of ways, still doesn't answer the problem of evil. Sure, God controls evil. Where does that evil come from, though? Well, humans in their free will cause this evil. Well, if God is meticulously providential in that, why did God not prevent that evil from happening? The meticulous providence has a problem with both human freedom and also a question as to where the problem of evil comes in. So meticulous providence, while being potentially the most biblically sound one and the most traditionally sound one from St. Augustine, still is unsatisfying to some people. And so the question, of course, is still trying to get answered. How do we account for evil? How do we account for human free will? Self-limiting providence tries to answer that question. Because God's perfect will for the universe is that all might be saved, that all would live in abundance of life. But God's perfect will for the universe yields to his permissive will on account of human freedom. For you who have grown up in traditions that you'll hear Calvinism and Arminianism thrown around, Calvinism being from John Calvin and Jacob Arminius being a Dutch theologian. If you've heard those two thrown around together, it's because Calvin and Arminius are sometimes lumped in as having like a particular side of how God is provident. In general, like I said, Calvin takes his meticulous providence from Augustine. He of course adjusts it. But human freedom is something that Arminius will usually rely on, because what human freedom does is it answers the problem of evil and the problem of and the question of human freedom. Because what happens is that in human freedom, this is where evil comes from. Now again, even in an Augustinian sense, you can still hold to original sin and believe that human freedom exists. So there are ways that you can do this. You have different theologies that will kind of be adjusted by this. Again, all theology is of one whole. You pull on one thing over here and it adjusts the other over here. Just remember, what we say about God's providence usually is directly associated with who we believe God is and how we believe God is revealed. So just keep those things in tension. But human freedom, in this particular sense, is where God's permissive will comes in. God actively permits human freedom. And again, from God's ontology, God creates in perfect freedom. Therefore, creatures in some way, shape, or form, if we believe that humanity is created in the imago Dei, the image of God, humans have some modicum of free will as their creator does. But human freedom is where we can bend our wills towards the things that are not good for us. Whether this is in an original sin sense or not, that's not the question that we're asking. Rather, our freedom can be turned towards the detriment of our souls. We can choose to sin. Whereas we say that God cannot sin. And so in God's permissive will, God permits human freedom. And logically, what that means is that God self-restrains, self-limits his providence to provide for human freedom because it doesn't turn us into robots. A practical way of describing this is that say that there's a scientist who builds a machine. If the scientist builds that machine without free will, is it really an agent? Do we say that there are agents that exist in the world that do not have free will? That is a huge philosophical question that dissertations have been written about. So I'm not going to try to answer that question for you. But the question is, how does God, being ultimately provident, allow for evil? Self-limiting providence will say that God allows for evil because God permits free will. God does not cause evil. God permits free will to exist because the ultimate use of our free will in the Christian tradition is the love of God and neighbor. The thing is, though, is that in God's permissive will, because we have the choice to make to love God and our neighbor, or to not, we can choose to do otherwise. Because of that permissive will, evil exists in the world, not because of God's perfect will, but because of God's permitting our freedom. Now, that may answer a couple of those questions, but what it doesn't answer, a weakness in this position, is that it does not account for how it seems that in Scripture, God is ultimately involved in everything that happens to work it according to his will. How can we say that there's a difference between the perfect will and permissive will of God, and what does that do to God's own self? If God has a permissive will in which his perfect will is not able to be enacted, does that make God God anymore? If there is a perfect will that God can enact that is yielded to his permissive will, why did God allow his permissive will to allow the Holocaust? That's a weakness in self-limiting providence, is that it does not explain why God permissively willed the Holocaust. Now, meticulous providence doesn't answer the problem of evil, where meticulous providence would say God actively willed that the Holocaust happened. And although it is an evil that arises, it's not out of God's own self, that's a difficult question to answer here. Self-limiting providence, again, leans more towards the side of permissive will, and then we ask the question, well, why did God not prevent this from happening if he had perfect will? It's another question. The third one is the newest one out of all of these. And this one is going to sound like this should be in the alternatives category. But let's pay close attention. Open theism. What open theism says is that basically what happens is that God is still ultimately provident. God is ultimately provident. So God has ultimate providence over the world and how things happen. What open theism will say, though, is that while God is ultimately provident, God does not necessarily have perfect foreknowledge. Now, this is what open theism tries to do. Again, we're trying to answer the problem of evil and human free will. What this says is orthodox, God is ultimately provident. That's kind of something we say. Orthodox, humans have some amount of free will. Again, this doesn't resist that. The difference between this and process theology is that God has the ability to affect his ultimate will. So God has the ability to affect and to drive the world to his perfect will. What this one tries to say is, again, it tries to pull on another piece of theology to try to get to where we can get a balance in providence, which is that it tries to say God does not necessarily have perfect foreknowledge of what will happen, but that God, when history occurs, enacts within that history his perfect will. The examples I've given so far. In open theism, in this kind of theology, it will say that God could not have had foreknowledge of the Holocaust. However, when the Holocaust happened, God's ultimate providence worked itself into that situation. We see this child suffering from, etc. God could not have ultimately foreknew that this child would have suffered this way. But now that we're here, God now can enact his perfectly provident will in this situation that he doesn't necessarily have perfect foreknowledge in. What this does is it removes God's omniscience And omniscience basically means that God knows everything, both in past, present, and future. And what this does is it removes God's foreknowledge about things so that God is still ultimately provident and ultimately respects human free will because God doesn't have omniscience. And that God works God's perfect will as history happens, as nature happens, and not in a preeminent sort of way, and not in a post-evident sort of way either. Now, like I said, this one may strike you as something that is outside of bounds of Christianity. But the thing is that this one is so new that we haven't really had to grapple with this yet. But what it tries to do, again, it tries to hold the traditional ideas of God is ultimately provident and that humans have some level of free will by answering that God does not have perfect foreknowledge. Now again, this will run into problems when we think about the role of the prophets in the Old Testament. We say that the prophets, of course, are describing their own situation and their own injustices in their situation, but we run into problems when we get to the New Testament if God did not have foreknowledge of how God was going to fix everything in the revelation of Jesus Christ. If God did not have perfect foreknowledge as to how this was going to happen, or what was going to happen, how do we make of the interpretation that the Gospels make of the prophets foretelling Jesus Christ? And even in the Emmaus Road experience, Jesus actually telling the disciples that Moses and the prophets spoke of him. That Moses and the prophets actually foretold the way that God, through Jesus Christ, would save the world. The removal of omniscience, while answering the question of God's providence as it comes to the problem of evil, and as it comes to human free will, what it does is it shifts the problem to God's foreknowledge, answering this question, but providing problems with another particular question, which is that, how do we understand the role of Scripture now? If God does not ultimately foreknow these things, how do we understand the Bible as a cohesive whole, or do we at all? This view right here actually messes with the way that we understand Holy Scripture interacting. This one right here kind of divides the books from each other, so to speak. The only thing that connects the books is temporally and culturally. Whereas if God's ultimate omniscience does exist, we can more fully argue a cohesive whole of these different pieces of literature within Scripture telling one story. So you see how this messes with another piece of theology to answer these questions. And that's the way with all theology. It always messes with these delicate balances. But in sum, generally what you will find within Christian tradition, as it comes to God's providence, because this one is so new, you will usually find people who are staunchly meticulous or staunchly self-limited. These two right here will come to blows over God's providence, and ultimately it actually has resulted in the fracture of several different denominations from each other. This is, growing up in the Baptist tradition, this is where you will find where the Southern Baptist Conference holds and where Free Will Baptists hold. Guess where Free Will Baptists fall into, and guess where SBC falls into, right? So this idea of how God is provident and how human free will interacts with these things, even on a theological and philosophical level, is a source of incredible division within the Protestant spectrum. The Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church, while still being one part of a whole communion, still have their differences over how to interpret this. The East, of course, doesn't like St. Augustine very, very much for various reasons, and so they don't rely on St. Augustine a whole lot, which is why the West is so affected by St. Augustine's meticulous providence, while the East, to a lesser extent. But where does that leave us? Where does that leave us? As it comes to unity, it might be helpful to remember in Isaiah. It might be helpful just to appeal to Isaiah in his second song that we have in our prayer book. I believe from Isaiah 12. I might be wrong about that, but you can look it up. But basically what he says is, my thoughts are not your thoughts, nor are your ways my ways, says the Lord. For as the heavens rain upon the earth, and I give snow, and it gives snow, so when my word goes forth from my mouth, it will not return to me empty. It will accomplish that which I have purposed and prosper in that for which I sent it. I think the unity needs to be a paradox and a holding together of number one and number two from earlier. We need to hold together God is perfectly provident. In however we want to work that out. And, so we need to hold this one, and humans have some level of choice. Where these two meet, intersect, rub against each other, smash into each other, these are the two things that perhaps in the unity spectrum we can appeal to. We appeal that God is perfectly provident in everything that happens within the world, and that humans have some level of choice. Where these two smash together and meet is where we have our diversity. And as long as we have a theology that affirms God's providence and human free will, we can necessarily have some sort of unitive conversation about these things. And the whole point of unity is not uniformity. That's not the same thing. Rather, the unity needs to be, we need to be united in the essentials, that these two things are true, and we need to be able to disagree with each other in fiery fashion, but also be able to still pray together. We perhaps need to revisit and re-examine the fractures of where these things come into, and we have to ask the question: are these worth it? Is it worth having such a view of meticulous providence that it necessarily excommunicates those who don't hold to it? Is it worth it having such a whole view of self-limiting providence that we excommunicate those who have a traditional view of St. Augustine? Do we hold to open theism that says that holds in tension both of these things while also discarding God's omniscience? We have to make that choice for ourselves in some way, but I think we also can say that we can at least hold to what Christians have usually used to describe how we understand God. I hope that you at least found something helpful about this. If anything else, I hope it was at least descriptive of why do we hold so strongly differences of opinion about God's providence. And I hope that maybe it gives you a little insight into where our premises come from, why we hold them so strongly, why we have so much invested in it. Because there's a lot invested in it. It's important. This is, like I said, perhaps the most important contemporary area of discussion around God. How does God's providence work when it comes to human free will and the problem of evil? Especially in the wake of the things we talked about. And undoubtedly, if 2,000 years of Christian tradition has not answered these questions, undoubtedly we probably will not answer these questions ultimately until we all gather together at that one table in the heavenly kingdom with God. We can ask God then how this all works. And again, just because we're in heaven does not mean we'll have perfect knowledge either. But maybe we can just leave this up to a divine paradox, and we can agree to disagree about the things that come out of it. With that said, friends, thank you so much for joining us for this discussion of the Mosaic of Christian Belief. Next week, we'll be discussing humanity and human nature. So please tune in with us around 9 o'clock every Sunday for these discussions. If you want to catch up with everything, please do see the descriptions in the videos below, or go to our YouTube channel to catch up on the playlist that has to do with this book study. Thank you all so much. I will see you in service here in just a few minutes.